what's going on, guys? How you doing? So, I got something I want to share with you. I just had a conversation not too long ago with a friend of mine, and I think this is a classic example of what happens with the paradox, or maybe that's not a paradox, but the issue that presents itself in believing in God. And that issue is that we find ourselves living in a world where crazy and bad things happen to relatively innocent people. And so how can this exist, right? If God's in control, how can bad things happen to genuinely innocent people? And why doesn't God intervene to protect, their free will, to protect, their right to not have to be murdered by this, whether in this particular story, it's a family member that this actually happened to. So, that's the question that kind of raises up is like, where's God at when stuff like this happens? And so Christians have to respond to this, and oftentimes what they do is they'll try to sidestep the issue, or they'll try to get God off the hook, by saying that, well, God doesn't want to interfere with free will. So he appears to want to favor the free will of the murderer, whose intent is to murder this family. It was two sisters and one of the sisters' sons, right? So what do you do with all that information? So I had the conversation with my friend, and we were discussing it, and he begins to come up with all these ad hoc theories about, well, maybe when the victims, died, the young boy and the two sisters, when they were murdered by one of the sisters' crazy ex-lovers, or whatever the scenario, something similar to that, maybe God was there in their time of need and helped them to not suffer. Well, that's a nice sentiment, that's a nice thought, but we don't know that. We don't know that it didn't happen. But it's like, there's no evidence to support that. All what we have to go on is two things. Innocent lives were not spared, and a God, if he really exists, was standing by watching this happen and did nothing about it. Now, I know Christians will say, well, because they want to get God off the hook, they don't want him to be culpable for any of the bad stuff that happens, right? So they'll say, well, it's the devil's fault. It's because the devil has dominion of this world, and that he's. Any of you who watched my videos in the past know this has kind of been my go-to. This is what Christians say, because generally this is their response: is that it's the devil's fault, right? It's the devil's fault because well, two things: God doesn't want to interfere with free will, and it appears that God doesn't have any control over the devil while he's on earth. He's been released on the earth, and he can have free reign for so many years, and then God's going to come back. It's like I said, they start coming up with all these contrived ad hoc theories to try to help get God off the hook, and so that he's not culpable for these innocent lives that were lost. And I just think that's despicable. I don't think it's grounded in any kind of rational thought to do that. I mean, I get that they being Christians, find themselves in a jam, and they need to get out of that jam by saying stuff like, well, maybe God would send the Holy Spirit to be with those people. And I don't know that isn't what happens. It could be. I've never been murdered and gone. None of us have had. When that happens, we're gone and we don't come back, and that's the end of us, right? So we have to go on what we have for information. Is that if there is a God and he exists, then he's watching all this happen. We don't know anything else, and we know that some, 3 souls were lost. For what reason? Because God didn't want to interfere with the free will of the murderer? How does that make any sense? So what do we do? Do we make up contrived cockamamie stories that make us feel better about the innocent lives that were lost, or what? So that's the conversation I had with my friend, and you just see that Christians are willing to go through great lengths and jump through all these hoops and do all these gymnastics so that, God doesn't do any bad things. Anything bad that happens, it's the devil's fault. And I'm not suggesting that God would necessarily do it, even though he did allow the devil to mess up Job's life. If you read the story about Job and what happened there, and that was over a bet with God the devil made with God. He made a bet saying, oh, I bet you he'll curse you. I bet, most of us rational thinking people look at a story like that and we realize that this is just not real. This is not what we look at when we see the real world. And that's my point that I'm trying to make in this video, is that what do we do when you have if a God exists and he does nothing? Isn't it much easier? I think this is the alternative. This is why I told my friend, I was like, this is why it's easier for me to take this approach and to look at things from this perspective, and which that perspective is that, God doesn't exist. And looking that way, we don't look at a world like, well, God, if you really exist, how could you allow this to happen? See, so it's counterproductive to think about a world that has a God that exists and allows these kind of things to happen, because then you're angry with God, and then you're angry. Why would he allow the murderer's free will to not be unimpeded, and yet the 3 lives that were lost? You see what I'm saying? So believing in Christianity, believing in God, at times it can do more harm than good, because the person, again, unless of course you're willing to make up cockamamie stories and say, well, God doesn't do any bad, only the bad comes from the devil, and that maybe God sent his angels to be there with those victims when they were being murdered. We don't know any of that. All we know is that supposedly a God exists. He did nothing to save these people, and their lives are lost. That's all we know. We don't know anything more than that. So if we're going off based off what we know, and then someone comes along and says, oh, but God really exists. Well, if he really exists, that means he's watching all this stuff happen. All this bad shit that goes on in the world, he's watching it. Yeah, he's watching it, and someday, see, that's the other side step that they use. Someday he's going to restore all the wrongdoing. And again, we have no basis to believe in that, other than just hearsay. There's nothing, oh no, we have the Bible to go back, because that's his promise to us, is that he's going to right all the wrongs, and we can get down the rabbit hole of the validity of the Bible and whether or not we can really trust it, and a lot of you will know already how I feel about that, and whether or not we really have the Word of God. And that's a video for another time. But so what do you do? If God really exists and he allows these things to happen, that's pretty messed up. So Christians have to make up these stories, and they have to find these ways of sidestepping the issue and getting God off the hook. And wouldn't it just be easier, is the point of my video, wouldn't it be just easier to say he doesn't exist? And then you wouldn't have to contend with that. Then you'd be like, well, bad stuff happens, and murderer, a bad, evil villain, whatever, bad person did something to innocent people. And this stuff happens all over the world, probably right as I'm speaking right now. It's simultaneously, it's happening. So isn't it much easier just to recognize that there is no divine providence, that there is no protector, there is no, because if you view the world from that lens, as if there is a God looking out for you, it seems like that creates a lot more internal struggle and anguish and more pain is inflicted on you if you believe in that sort of thing, unless of course you make up excuses for how to get him off the hook, and you make up these ad hoc theories to get God off the hook so he's not culpable. But that's what you have to do in order for the God exists, bad stuff happens, but he's off the hook because of this. That's what happens with it, and they've had centuries to think about explanations like this to try to explain, well, the world is messed up and bad things happen, and it's not God's fault. If God's in control, it can't be his fault. It's the devil's fault, and God doesn't intervene because he doesn't want to interfere with free will. If you can't see it for what it is, and I get it with my good friend, he's at that place where he's more comfortable with believing this stuff and holding on to that God exists, and God's ways are higher than our ways, kind of thing, and again, I'm not saying they could, but it seems to me that when you look around the world, there's very little evidence to support the Christian's argument. There's very little evidence. Just the existence of the Bible doesn't prove anything. It proves that at some point in time, a group of people believed a certain way, believed certain theology or whatever, and had certain practices. And that's all it tells us. It doesn't mean that it's the smoking gun and it proves that God really exists or anything in the Bible is true. So you can't fall back on the Bible. You can't revert to that and say, well, that means that, everything I say is true because it's in the Bible. Because lots of people, no Christian would judge the religion of Islam by the Quran and say, well, because the Quran, exists, then Islam is true. They wouldn't look at it like that. So anyways, I just think that you have a problem when you look at the world that, like a God exists, when you insist that a God exists, and then you have to make it. Now, I know for many Christians, this probably isn't an issue for them. Because they've got enough explanations, they've got enough ways of sidestepping, enough ways to get God off the hook and cast the blame on their scapegoat, the devil, and protect and say, well, God doesn't want to interfere with free will. Well, a freaking miracle once in a while wouldn't hurt him, especially when you have innocent people, young children that could use a miracle, but yet God is silent. And that's what we see when we look around the world. So these are the kind of reasons why that really make me question whether or not God really exists or not. Let me know what you think. Leave your comments below.